I have absolutely zero respect for people who come on the microphone. They only have 5 minutes of content and they stretch it to 10 minutes and tell you to like stay tuned until the end for the conclusion. No, conclusion up front. For the vast majority of people, the vast majority of scenarios and situations you might be in, the best version of Puyo Puyo to play is the Sega Megadrive or Sega Genesis version of Puyo Puyo 2 on an emulator, 2-player, selecting the rainbow board, difficulty level 4. Now, as we get into why that is such a specific recommendation, you will start to understand how that Sega Genesis, Sega Mega Drive version relates to the other options that are out there. This is the year 2023. What I'm saying is probably going to be the same in 2024, 2025, 2035. Cost is a real factor. What is and isn't possible in terms of emulation is a real factor. Let's just say hypothetically, I were to tell you that the best version of this game, not that I can hold one up here, was the Neo Geo Pocket Color version. Okay, if you don't know, Neo Geo Pocket Color was a competitor to the Game Boy Color. Today, it is much more expensive, and once you buy one, you probably have to modify it to get it working well. It's a good version of the game. It is a good version of the game. The cost to you in the 21st century to own 2 copies of this game on 2 actual original Neo Geo Pocket Colors, it's so extraordinary. Like at that point, you'd be better off buying 2 laptop computers and emulating 2 versions of the game. But this gets into another interesting factor, right? Is it even possible today to emulate 2 Neo Geo Pocket Colors and to emulate the link cable between 2 versions of it playing? It's very easy to emulate one console today, 2023. Whether it's possible or impossible, the quality of your experience in emulating 2, let's say Atari Lynxes linked together, 2 Sega Game Gears linked together, even to emulate 2 like classic Game Boys, to emulate this in 2-player mode linked, it's not impossible. The quality of the experience overall is going to be appallingly low. And I would just mention you can get emulated 2-player Game Boy and Game Gear games on the Nintendo 3DS, 2DS, that group of systems, and the quality is indeed very low. So look, recognizing cost as a factor, that's one reason to lean towards emulation. But the ultimate reason here is the quality of the software itself. And yes, the software relates to the tactile experience of what kind of fucking controller, joystick, peripheral you're going to use. I intentionally did not clean this before coming on camera. Look at that, guys. Look at the layer of dust. I own a bunch of these things. I never use them, but this is decorating my closet. There's a thick layer of dust on it. But this is an absolutely fabulous joystick, right? This is not. So when you're saying what's the best version of Puyo Puyo, if you're using an emulator, even if you're using an emulator on an Android phone, you can plug in this joystick. You could, in theory, any joystick, but any joystick that's USB or any joystick where you have a dongle, you have an adapter that will adapt the plug USB. I can plug this into any emulator, and then, as I say, play the Sega Genesis version. It's not the only version. I'm going to get into Wes's version. If you want to play Puyo Puyo on this, right, any of these, guess what you're limited to? Look at that D-pad. Look at that, right? So this is also a factor. It's not just sheer cost. It's what you're getting for the cost. This video is inspired by kind of 2 memories. One, there's another YouTube channel that just called Sega Head. He straight up asked me to do the video. I've done so many videos in response to one request from one person. I was like, you know what? I should do the video. But the other is this. I remember seeing a comment on YouTube maybe 4 years ago. It was, maybe 3.5 years ago. and it was under. Oh yeah, I remember what video I was making when I happened to see this comment, so I could figure out whether it was 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And there was a comment from a guy, and he just said below the video was a review of this version of the game. This is Puyo Puyo 2 for Game Boy, and he said simply, it was a white American guy. He said, "My girlfriend and I don't have a better way to play the game together. We just bought 2 original Game Boys and a link cable and 2 copies of the game just for Puyo Puyo." And the funny thing was, I just sat there and I thought about it. I was like, you know what? A lot of people are probably in that situation. It's one of the few games you really can play with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend, with your husband, with your wife. It's one of those games that's worth having. I don't know at that time what the cost was for a decent Game Boy Color today. Easily $100 US. If you get one for $80 US or $60 US, I'm happy for you, but this is easily a $100 US purchase. So if you buy 2 of these plus 2 copies of the game, easily $200 US. So again, be a slight exaggeration to say this is the same price range as buying 2 laptop computers, but this is a significant cost. And we're not really talking about a luxury product. Before I move on, I might as well just cover the Game Boy versions of the game. We have all 3 here. Puyo Puyo 1, Puyo Puyo 2, Puyo Puyo 3. This cost us very little money, but probably cost us more time than money. There are those 3 versions of the game. The first Puyo Puyo, we got this for free in a package deal buying a copy of Puyo Puyo 2. It's notoriously laugh out loud awful. This is one of the This is one of the worst versions of the game ever made. This is one of the worst versions of any game ever made. It's just, it will just induce laughter how bad it is. But hey, you can get it framed and put it on your wall. If you're in university, you can put this on your dorm room wall, put it on the door of your dorm, show off so people come, oh, this is a guy who knows Puyo Puyo. It's purely decorative. Puyo Puyo 2 for you can see from the cartridge, this is a black and white Game Boy game, but you should play it on Game Boy Color because the screen on the black and white Game Boy is so terrible. Just brief digression. I do not think you need to upgrade the screen on a Game Boy Color. The screen is good enough on Game Boy Color, but original black and white Game Boy, the screen is so terrible. You have to pay to mod it. And then again, is that adding $50? Is that adding $100 to go? Like if you buy 2 modded IPS Game Boys, you're getting into astronomical sums of money. Again, to run a piece of software that your cellular phone could run, that your laptop, that this joystick has a built-in single board computer. This can run a Game Boy game or a Sega Genesis game or what have you. I mean, your toaster can run this. There's so little. I don't know what kind of toaster you own. Possibly your toaster, possibly your fridge can run this game. Not as portable. I mean, your fridge, your toaster, not gonna carry. But anyway, this black and white version of the game, you would nevertheless want to play it on a Game Boy Color, not a black and white Game Boy, unless you're spending yet more money on a bespoke Game Boy. This is one of the best versions of the game. I'll come back to why, how closely it competes with the Sega Genesis, Sega Megadrive version. As a 2-player game, actually, you know what? Sorry, as a 1-player game, it's better than the Genesis version, period. It's better than the Megadrive, period. It's better than the arcade version, which will come up here in just a moment. So as a 1-player version of the game, it's arguably the best version of the game. As a 2-player game, it's very close. It is as good or maybe better. Yeah, I could even say that. It's as good as or maybe better than the Sega Genesis version. And we'll get into exactly why. But cost is a factor. If we already owned this crap, Melissa, from your childhood, right? Melissa had one of these sitting around from her childhood. So this was a $10 Canadian, is like $8. This was not a lot of money or a lot of effort for us. But if you don't already own 1 or 2 of these with a link cable, right, you can't justify the cost compared to emulating the Sega Genesis version. Just really briefly, what are the advantages and disadvantages of this? The disadvantage is obviously graphical. It's not in color. And Puyo Puyo is a color matching game. Either you personally can tolerate that or you can't. I can. Like, for whatever reason, it doesn't really bother me playing this on a Game Boy Color. I would not play it on a black and white Game Boy, as mentioned. The vast majority of human beings would say, look, having colors on screen is fundamental to this particular game. This doesn't work. you're correct. It's a subjective thing, but there's no counter argument there. By all means, just play the Sega Genesis version instead. So there is no color, and most of the Puyo Puyos, most of the actual pieces in the game, do not have eyes. They do not have animated facial expressions, eyes, etc. So that's also a step down. And there's a very interesting graphical comparison to the Game Gear version. Don't mix this up, though. The Game Gear version of Puyo Puyo 2, not Puyo Puyo 1. If you wonder why I'm mispronouncing 2 as Tsu, it's the actual title of the game. Not worth explaining. So my pronunciation of the numeral 2 will sound funny sometimes. Okay. So there are some stark graphical disadvantages. The version of the music is great in this version. That's come up on my YouTube channel before, believe it or not. Okay. The advantage is that this gives you up front in a very clear and transparent form the options for what kind of two-player mode you want to play. So you can play 6-chain combo Puyo Puyo as a game variant. You can play 2 Puyo combo as a variant. You can play with 4 or 5 colors. You can play the different number of colors in play. You can, even though it's in Japanese, the menu it gives you for the different two-player modes is excellent here. Whereas in the Sega Genesis version, the Megadrive version, it's all implicit. You have to figure it out. It is like zero transparency how to figure out what the differences are between the different boards and different game modes. It's baffling, and it's not that it's in Japanese. It's that there's no text, there's no explanation at all. Like, kind of good luck figuring it out. Okay, I admit there's a little bit of Japanese. There's a little bit of Japanese on screen, but it's mostly going to be through trial and error or finding a file on the internet from someone who's figured out how it works. So that is a big advantage here, and overall the gameplay is good. So I just want to round out that series. We start to get into another interesting thing about the history of Puyo Puyo here. For no good reason, the greatest version of Puyo Puyo is Puyo Puyo 2. The sequel is Puyo Puyo 3, also known as Puyo Puyo Sun. In brief, Puyo Puyo 3 is a worse game in each and every way than Puyo Puyo 2. It is worse. Don't want to get into a monologue as to why it's worse. I think it'd just be a bit boring for you. However, if you are interested in Puyo Puyo 3, this is the best version of the game. So you do not want to play the version of the game that's on Nintendo 64, for example. So if that is an interest of yours, you can probably get this for $10, maybe $15, but it's not a valuable version of the game, and you get it with nice 2D graphics, not some kind of horrible 3D graphics, if Puyo Puyo 3 interests you. However, both as a one-player and a two-player game, Puyo Puyo 3 is worse than Puyo Puyo 2 in every way, so why bother? This is probably a good segue for me to get into talking about the Nintendo DS, DSi, 2DS, 3DS era. In short, it's all bad news. I already own this kind of crap because I have a daughter who I now never get to see, but we first got into spending money on video game hardware and software for my daughter. So when you have this kind of thing sitting around anyway, and you have the intellectual interest I have in comparing every version of Puyo Puyo, I did give some time to the DS and 3DS versions. I'm not going to list them all off here because they're bad. And this video is about the best version of the game you can play, not the worst version. However, long story short, it's bad. And this is not the only version. There's a whole succession of versions. Some of the versions were download only from the eShop. So today you'd have to pirate them. I could talk about this. There's no point. But there are several Japanese only releases also, where there's like the 30th anniversary, the 35th anniversary. They did have a succession of these in Japan. This one is titled Puyo Pop Fever. It does have a 2-player mode in which you can turn Fever off and play a more classic or original version of the game, and that brings it closer to Puyo Puyo 2, because Fever is the new innovation for this version of the game, if you hadn't guessed. I would not say this is terrible. You can play 2-player with 2 consoles. So again, if you don't already own these consoles, if this isn't already gathering dust for you in your closet, it's not worth the money. But if you have 2 of these sitting around gathering dust and you see this for $5-10, you want to play 2-player with your girlfriend, fine, give it a try. It's not a fate worse than death. But, basically, it is only something you pick up for $5 for a lark. It is not a good version of the game. It is not remotely. the best version of the game. And wow, can we just have a brief digression here about voice acting in Puyo Puyo? This is the most cursed and disappointing fucking series in the world. And how could it be so hard? How could it be so hard to get some talented voice actors in the booth to deliver such emotionally deep, complex lines as fire? Like, there's so little talent required, and yet they keep falling short of it again and again and again. So the voices also in this are terrible. The characters are. And end of digression. So generally, this. Indeed, right. Melissa's joking off camera about this. You know, again, if you have this sitting around gathering dust, it's no big deal. It's $5, but once you buy this, it is very likely to gather dust. Okay, so what are the criteria whereby, as I say, for most people in most circumstances, the best choice is going to be the Sega Genesis version. And then for some people, in some circumstances, again, if you can emulate this on 2 cell phones, 2 Android phones that are linked, I'm happy for you. Maybe people are going to be watching this video 10 years in the future, like, what do you mean, bro? I just press a button on my Android phone. I just press a button on my laptop computer. It's so easy to emulate linkable. At this moment, it's not. So this game for the 2-player mode, for some people, would be the best version. One of the most important factors is the number of colors on screen. So when you start up the Sega Genesis version, or aka Sega Megadrive version, Puyo Puyo 2 on the rainbow board. So you'll see what I mean. You get to choose different boards, different arenas, if you like. You choose the rainbow colored board, and then you set it to difficulty level 4. You get 5 colors on screen. Not 4 colors, not 3 colors, right? This is a huge fundamental difference in gameplay. And you get what some people call Ice Puyo. Ice Puyo are the square double strength Puyo. They're the, when you attack your opponent, it takes 2 rounds to dissolve and remove this form of Puyo. Okay, why is that so important? When you have so-called Ice Puyo, when you have so-called double strength Puyo, it makes the whole game less sudden death. So the fundamental problem with Puyo Puyo 1, and there is a good version of Puyo Puyo 1 that you can play on 2DS. There's a very good version on Game Gear. It's actually the emulation of the Game Gear version. Puyo Puyo 1 is a slightly interesting game, but it's just the first person to get a combo that wins. It's very sudden death, very quickly. You feel, if you have any skill in the game, but even if you don't, frankly, it's very, very sudden death. Everything's over very rapidly in a few seconds. And there's no tug of war. There's no push and pull of it going back and forth between you and your girlfriend, you and your husband, you and your wife. So the total number of colors is significant. Playing with only 3 colors, I hate. Playing with 4 colors, I can tolerate. It's really when you get to 5 colors, that's a bit more of a thinking man's game. It's a little bit more intellectual compared to Pac-Man. It's a highly intellectual game. But then also there's just the question of, if you get one nice combo, does your opponent have the ability to turn around and come back? And they fight, or is that just it? It's just a race to who gets a decent attack, where the first strike ends the match. So that's crucial. Some of you may be wondering, why would I endorse the Mega Drive version as opposed to the arcade version? So you can emulate the arcade version of Puyo Puyo 2, and there are legal ways to buy it, including the company known as M2 made a version of an adaptation of the arcade version for the Nintendo 3DS and Nintendo 2DS. It ain't worth it, bro. I mean, basically, the Sega Genesis, Sega Mega Drive version of Puyo Puyo 2, it is better than the arcade version in every way. I'm not saying it's drastically better, but it's better. So don't even bother. That's the basic truth about that. If you personally prefer the arcade version for some tiny technical reason, I'm not mad at you. They are very similar. But no, as a 2-player game, it's the Genesis version that's better. And I was complaining before that the Genesis version, you kind of have to figure out implicitly what the difference is between the different modes, like why it is you want to play on the rainbow board difficulty 4. Well, the arcade version is even more hopeless this way in terms of figuring out what the options in front of you are. So again, although I do like this version of the game, I also do like the Game Gear version of Puyo Puyo 2. Whether or not you like the graphics better, whether or not you like the music better is very subjective. The Game Gear version is in color. The cost of having 2 Game Gears with 2 modified screens, 2 modified batteries, like, so you want a USB power, modern battery, modern screen, modified Game Gear. That'll cost you more than a Nintendo Switch. It'll cost you about as much as a laptop computer just to play the Game Gear version. I find that preposterous. If you're already that deep into it, I guess have 2 of those and so on. But, again, so for some people, the choice between graphics is significant, choice and total cost is significant, but no matter how much you may like this version of the game or the Game Gear version of the game, you are stuck with that D-pad and those buttons and those screens. I don't even need to plug this into a computer. I can plug this into a laptop or a phone and then have arcade-style joystick to play 2-player with my girlfriend. I can actually run the Genesis ROM straight off this. I can run the Sega Genesis Megadrive version. I can plug this into a TV. We can play 2-player with arcade-style controls. If that's not significant to you, I don't know what the fuck is wrong with you, frankly. But again, that's the reason. I mean, there's total cost involved. But overall, in playing the Mega Drive or Genesis version of the game, you are paying the least amount of money for the best experience for most people under most circumstances. So that's it. I think the tragedy of Puyo Puyo is what I already alluded to. This was a great idea for a game that came from a company that did not care about it. Compile was a company deeply, deeply committed to making what we now call shoot 'em up games. They made the Sega Master System version of R-Type, for example, which is a real masterpiece on 8-bit hardware. There's a long list of great games that consist of a spaceship flying around shooting things that's made by this company. And this is a very funny story how they had this idea for a puzzle game originally on the Famicom disk system. And the first several versions of the game are really bad. The Famicom version is terrible. Famicom disk system version is terrible. The first arcade version is pretty terrible. But they stuck at it. And then they kind of had this masterpiece, although it's a flawed masterpiece with Puyo Puyo 2. There's a lot wrong with Puyo Puyo 2. We can list off what's wrong with it. And then after that, the series gets worse and worse and worse. And we make the transition into the horrible era of 3D graphics being used for a 2D game, which works really badly, and using these frameworks like Unity, using these kind of prefabricated programming frameworks for current versions of the game. And I just say already in the transition from Puyo Puyo 2 to Puyo Puyo 3, you think, the people who are in charge of this game, do they even understand what makes it worse? Do they understand what made this worth playing in the first place? And the answer is no, they don't. Like, Compile got something right, and they just didn't know what to do with it when they had this, kind of masterpiece, the Puyo Puyo 2. It's quite common in the history of game development. I don't know if the one guy who understood Puyo Puyo 2 quit or something. I just want to mention briefly, exactly the same thing is true about Sega's ownership of Columns. There's one version of Columns. So Columns is a Tetris-like game, a game competing with Tetris. It's some way similar to Puyo Puyo, some way similar to Tetris. But, Columns, the Game Gear version, 8-bit Game Gear, is a masterpiece. Fantastic. I assume the same people worked on the Master System version, which is ugly, but still excellent. And every other version of the game is garbage. And they kept making sequels, and the people making the sequels didn't understand what made the original game so great. And only the 8-bit version, the Sega Genesis version, is garbage. 16-bit version is garbage. Every arcade version is garbage. So, I think it's just the structure and organization of a lot of these companies. Puyo Puyo has its moment with Puyo Puyo 2, and then already with Puyo Puyo 3, it's garbage. And after that, it gets worse and worse and worse. I've said a million times, I'm only interested in playing video games that are all wrapped up in 5 minutes. Once you're good at the game, one round of Puyo Puyo is maybe 1 minute and 30 seconds. If me and my there will never be a day where my girlfriend and I sit down and play Puyo Puyo for 2 hours. It's never going to happen, guys. This is not a time-consuming hobby. But the irony is, if you want to play a really good version of the game, for a lot of people, it becomes an expensive hobby. So I'm making this video partly to warn you, it doesn't have to be. For most people, just embrace the barbarity of emulation. Figure out a way to play that Mega Drive version of the game. And for a minority of people, if you want to, yeah, you can dig around and blow the dust off your Game Boy Link cable.